Hello everyone. In this video, I plan to take you through some of the key points of the chapter on structure in our textbook. It's actually kind of a beefy chapter. It's fairly long. I would suggest really spending some time reading it, annotate it, really kind of take in the examples that Allie presents to you, because this chapter has a lot in it. It's something that you can keep coming back to. I know it is a long chapter, so it's going to be really tempting to skim it. And my suggestion would be, okay, in the points where you're most confident, go ahead and skim it. But in some of the places where you're not all that confident, or maybe it's new, like when he's talking about the bias of the audience or something like that, you might want to actually spend some time reading it. This chapter does provide a lot of examples, which is cool and kind of meta in a way, because one of the key points is that providing examples can help engage your audience. So this is split up in a few kind of sub-chapters. So the main section is structure, the strategy you choose, and then it goes critical error by critical error. And I wanted to kind of point out a few key things that may not be immediately obvious. One is, like I said, in a meta kind of way, that Allie uses a lot of the strategies in his writing that he's talking about in presentation. Thinking about connecting with the audience by using stories. You'll notice that his chapters and subchapters usually start with a very engaging example of a scientist who presented this well, a scientist who did not present this well, and then he goes into some of the details on how you might be able to do it. So starting with a story in that way engages the audience in the introduction. You'll also notice that he asks you questions. He brings the audience in, using second person, asking you to remember the talks that you've seen that look like this, or remember the times that you were bored by a presentation, to remember the times that a speaker put a whole bunch of text on the slide and lost you. So bringing your audience in by using second person is another really great strategy to begin with and to bring in sort of at multiple times during the presentation. So short of those stories, I think a couple of key things that are worth noting are on page 51 over here. There's a picture of a mountain. And this analogy, it's neat because it shows how an analogy can be really powerful too. I think this analogy works pretty well, and Allie keeps coming back to it. This idea that you're taking your audience up a path to the top of the mountain to get the big view. And they need to know what that path looks like, and when they're in the beginning of that path, and when they're in the middle of that path, and when they're in the end of the path, and also when they're about to change direction. And so that's kind of the way he frames thinking about transitions and the various pieces of the presentation. So I think kind of paying attention to that metaphor and looking at the way he approaches it in multiple places here would be a really nice kind of way to go through this chapter. So organization is the path up the mountain. And there are many ways he breaks it down. A couple of other key things that I noticed that I wanted to point out to you. There are a number of ways that Allie gives you strategies to transition from idea to idea. You can do it verbally, you can do it through your slides, you can even do it through a pause in your own voice. So as an element of your delivery, you can make it clear that you're in for transition. If you are doing a group presentation with other members of your lab, switching from presenter to presenter suggests we're on to a new thing. One thing I did want to suggest to you that's not in here is, I don't know if you've seen these, but PowerPoint has templates where there are portions of, let's say you have 3 sections of your presentation and they're named. And I'll use one of Allie's examples here, which is pre-combustion methods, combustion methods, and post-combustion methods. So he's kind of looking at these 3 things in this particular talk. If you're going to go into all three of those, and those are the main categories, there are PowerPoint templates where they're almost tabs at the bottom that show the three parts of your presentation. And with each of them, it's like highlighted when you're talking about that one. So you've got your whole slide, but essentially at the bottom, there's a little tab that would say pre-combustion methods. And it will remind us of where we are in the presentation. I will try to find an example of a presentation online that uses that strategy. I've had students use that strategy before, and it is really nice because you're basically showing them the path up the mountain at all times. We can see, oh, here are the things we're going to talk about, and here's where we are with them. And then when you switch to the next one, it's that center tab that gets highlighted, and the left tab ends up not highlighted anymore. And I've found that to be really neat. It is not something that I see in all presentations. It's not necessary, but if you find that that's a strategy you like, I do think the audience appreciates. So that was a suggestion I wanted to make for you. There's some really interesting stuff on emphasis. And then Allie goes into scope. How do you decide what depth and what breadth to go into? And again, I think there are some really great images here that, on page 60, there's breadth versus depth kind of graphic. There are a couple of things that look at how much speculation you want to do after going into depth. Do you want to go into the territory of what we don't know yet? And how do you decide? One thing I wanted to point out here is on page 64 and 65, and this is another strategy that you can consider in your own presentations as you think about evidence. Allie does a comparison between a Nobel Prize speech that had an introduction that was unsuccessful, or a scope that was unsuccessful, and then one that was very successful. And as you read the two, you, the audience, are able to come to that conclusion as well and to figure out how one is successful and the other one isn't. And so it's neat because it's one thing for Allie to just say, you should have a scope that looks like this. You shouldn't try to cover everything. You should draw your audience in. But what does that look like? And what it looks like is the introduction to the Nobel Prize speech on page 65, in contrast to the one on 64. One of the neat things of the examples that he uses, one of the things that I really like, is these are high-profile examples. These are Nobel Prize speeches. They're scientists we know, by and large. He's using examples of Niels Bohr and Einstein. So these are very accessible to the audience who would be reading this, which is scientists. So I think that's a really neat thing that he's doing that you can kind of consider in your presentations as well. Think about the examples that you use. I wanted to point out a couple other things. On page 70, there's a super helpful list of 4 items. I've put a little bracket around them here for myself. That list of 4 items on page 70, I would bookmark it, I would put a bracket around it, I would, stick a little Post-it tab in your book or something like that, and keep coming back to it at the beginning of the presentation. These are questions that should be answered. They're questions that your audience shouldn't be wondering about after you've begun your presentation. What is the subject? Why is it important? What do I need to understand or to believe it? And in what order are you going to present it? And many of you identified that order of the presentation as something that you found unsatisfying in the example assertion evidence presentations that you watched online on that assertion evidence website. A number of you said, oh, it would have been really nice to have an outline slide in the beginning or some sort of map of what was going to be covered. That was you realizing that you were missing item 4 on this list as an audience, and that would have been helpful to map your way through the presentation. In the analogy of the mountain, it is a map of the mountain. Show them a map of the mountain. Show them a picture of where you're going. And so in what order are you going to present this? One thing that I thought is fairly helpful, and I can give you a little bit more clarification on, is at the top of page 71. It says, in a 50-minute talk, an audience will accept up to 10 minutes on the introduction. In a 15-minute conference presentation, though, you should limit the introduction to no more than 5 minutes. I think that's pretty good advice. The way I think about it personally is I try to stick with, for whatever I'm introducing, no more than 10% the length of the talk as a whole. So if it's a 10-minute talk, a couple minutes, 2 minutes on the introduction, and then on to the meat of it. In a 50-minute talk, maybe 10 minutes, maybe up to 10 minutes. In a 30-minute talk, then 5 or 6 minutes max. So this is actually something, it's a formula that I use in technical reports as well for my technical writing students. If they're writing a proposal or, kind of a more business report, a recommendation report, something like that, I suggest that the executive summary be no more than 10%. The part that's going to draw the reader or the viewer, the audience in, you can do it in 10% the length of the whole thing. I think much more than 10%, and you're losing an opportunity to give that depth that they're going to want, especially with a scientific presentation to, let's say in an academic conference or something like that. People are coming looking for that depth. And so if you spend too much time introducing, it's a missed opportunity to go into some level of depth. So I kind of wanted to give you that 10% as a possible way of thinking about it. I also love on 72 and 73 the contrast between what a normal talk might sound like in the beginning. On 72, there's kind of a fill-in-the-blank example in the middle that goes with the discovering where mercury goes after it depletes from the atmosphere slide. But then we get to see the real introduction that the scientist who presented this did, and it's very effective. So I would definitely suggest taking a look at that. One other thing I wanted to point out is on the losing the audience on the trail. There are a couple of really good examples with this is page 85 with the cheetah. There's an overview slide, and then 1, 2, 3 slides that signal transitions. And I wanted to show you a chart here. I would almost photocopy this or take a camera phone picture of it so you have it really handy. On 96. All right. There. So it's page 96. It's different types of logical evidence in descending order of strength. It's a very nice way to just think about your evidence and what kind of thing it is, how it engages your audience, how strong it is. Reasoning, facts, statistics, examples, and analogies. As far as when you're thinking about evidence, deductive reasoning, inductive reasoning, facts, and statistics are very compelling, or can be if you really think about how to frame them, making sure that you're comparing comparable things, showing trends, especially in a scientific presentation. These things they're the king. Like, they are really compelling to your audience. But examples and analogies do have their place. They make it engaging to a broader audience. They work well in mapping the importance for something. Individual examples can be very compelling about the impact of your work. Let's say you're doing something in the healthcare space. If you can show a way it helped an individual patient, it can connect with that sort of emotional side of things. Allie does point out the appeals to emotion, the appeals to logic, and the appeals to credibility. You may have heard these maybe in high school or undergrad as ethos, pathos, and logos. So in traditional argumentation, those are kind of the 3 pillars, and using all of them to different extents can create a really compelling argument. So you are probably going to spend most of your time in the logic category because it is a scientific presentation. But don't forget about appealing to the emotion of the audience, especially in thinking about the impact of your work. And then also don't forget about making it clear, if it isn't initially clear, what your credibility is to speak to this. And sometimes it is initially clear. You're speaking at an academic conference, you're a graduate student in this lab. Once you put your credentials out there, that pretty much takes care of it. There are other places, though, where you would have to kind of maybe sell the idea of yourself and your expertise a little more. I think as I was reading this, one of the examples that kept coming up for me was in sort of recently hearing Dr. Fauci talk about the vaccine, the coronavirus vaccine, and its efficacy, its safety, and the kind of ways of engaging with a wide audience, showing compelling data, but also telling story in a way that will make people safe, and really thinking about the biases of the audience. And I mean, there are ways he does this well, and there are ways that you can look at it and be pretty critical of it. And it's a fairly impossible position, but it's definitely one when you think about somebody, and really anyone who's trying to present in a way to try to get people to get the vaccine who may be hesitant about it. Consider the strategies they're using. How strong are they? You can even do this while you're watching the news, or do people watch the news anymore? Well, while you're watching the news on YouTube, maybe not on TV, but as you take a look at people presenting on the safety of the vaccine, or why we should encourage children to get the vaccine when it is available to them. How do they approach it? How do they engage their audience? How compelling are they, and how successful do you think they are? That would be a really neat thing to evaluate as you're looking at just the news over the next few weeks. So yeah, I think that would be a good idea just on your own. And that sort of fits into Ali's antagonistic audience category that he talks about in the sort of the end of this chapter. So those are the few key things I wanted to just point out. Keep coming back to this chapter. I think it's very helpful and very interesting. I think the examples are really compelling. So it's certainly a chapter I plan to come back to as I, let's say, get ready to present for a conference, or present to a larger class with something more than just a lecture like this, where I'm pointing you to a few key things. If I am, let's say, explaining to an entire class a particular concept in detail where they haven't read the chapter, or this is their first introduction to it, I might consider taking a look again at that graphic about scope versus depth, about ways of approaching things for multiple audiences that have multiple levels of interest and also levels of expertise. So I think this chapter is really helpful. I know it's long though, so if you didn't get to the whole thing, it's fine now, but definitely hang on to this and get to it at some point when you do have the time. Go through, take some notes, and use it, because I think it is something you'll keep coming back to. Everybody have a great day. I hope you enjoy this video. Please let me know if you have any questions. I'm accessible by email. You know how to find me. So definitely let me know if you have any questions, and I look forward to seeing you in class. Thank you.